Hi, this is Pastor Barry with the third in a series of videos on the themes of the upper story. This one on chapters 9 and 10. Chapter 9 is entitled The Faith of a Foreign Woman because Ruth is from Moab. She is not born an Israelite. She's a foreigner, though she does eventually convert. I think we see three, or at least three, connections to the upper story in this brief chapter, which I think includes the entire book of Ruth. It's a pretty short book. The first is this covenant relationship between Ruth and Naomi, which I believe is a picture of the kind of relationship that God is calling us to with himself and with his people. It is a picture of discipleship. In that famous passage in Ruth 1:16 and 17, Ruth tells Naomi, where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. It is an extraordinary promise, both for its comprehensiveness. She doesn't just promise to stay with Naomi. She promises to become part of Naomi's people group and to worship Naomi's God. And it's also extraordinary for the duration of the promise. She doesn't promise Naomi, for as long as you live, I will stay with you. She says, even after you die, I will stay committed. Your people will continue to be my people. Your God will be my God. And when I die, I want to be buried in your land. And I believe that that is the kind of relationship that God calls us to with himself and with his people. It is not a light thing to just believe something in our heads but have it not affect our life. It is a lifetime commitment to the one true God and to his people, a comprehensive commitment of loyalty. So that's the first connection I see to the upper story, is that this covenant relationship between Ruth and Naomi is a picture of discipleship. Secondly, the idea of the kinsman redeemer. The Baker Evangelical Dictionary says this: the Hebrew term for kinsman redeemer, which is ga'al, designates a male relative who delivers or rescues, redeems property or person, avenges the murder of a relative as a guiltless executioner, and receives restitution for wrong done to a relative who has since died. The unique emphasis of the redemption, salvation, vindication associated with the kinsman redeemer is the idea that this action is carried out by a kinsman on behalf of a near relative in need. This idea is most clearly illustrated in the book of Ruth. And so in the book of Ruth, Boaz is the kinsman redeemer. He is the near relative who buys back the land that Naomi had lost, had to sell off, and gets it back for her, and then marries her daughter-in-law and gives her a son who is kind of like Social Security in a system where there was no Social Security, kind of a retirement plan for Ruth and for Naomi. This son will be able to work the land. He'll be able to continue the family name and inherit the land and pass it on to his descendants. In effect, what Boaz has done is to save Naomi and Ruth, to remove their disgrace, to provide for their financial needs, and to kind of cover them with his protection. And this, of course, is a picture of the coming Messiah, the picture of Jesus, who is our near relative, who is not just God, but God in human flesh. So he's one of us, and who does what is necessary to redeem our lives, to buy us back out of slavery so that we can have a life now and forever. He covers us with his protection. He provides for us and gives us his name. So that is the kinsman redeemer. And again, a kind of a foreshadowing, an Easter egg of Jesus in this man Boaz. I think we also see a touch of the upper story in the way that Ruth's lower story is connected to the upper story. Ruth is this widowed foreigner who ends up in the line of King David, the most famous king in all of Israel's history, and also in the line of the Messiah himself, of Jesus. And what an extraordinary thing. I mean, I think part of what we learn in this is that no matter how unlikely we imagine ourselves, God has ways of working us into the upper story that we cannot imagine. And that what needs to happen is we need to be committed to him and allow him to work his will through us to accomplish his upper story through our lower stories. Chapter 10 is entitled Standing Tall, Falling Hard. Standing tall because Saul was a tall man. And the key question in this chapter is, who is the king? God's intention is that God would be the king of his people. But instead, throughout the period of the judges, people just did what was right in their own eyes. It was as if everybody were their own king. And the results of that were horrendous. The people repeatedly fell into idolatry, which led to slavery and oppression by other peoples. And then they would cry out, and God would raise up a judge, a deliverer, a sort of symbol of the Messiah to set them free. And then they would live that way for a while, only to fall back into idolatry again. And what we find in this chapter, well, backing up, so Samuel is the last of the judges, and they reject his leadership. And what we find out in this chapter is that the people of Israel want a human king. And what is significant about that is that they want a human king because they want to be like everyone else. And this is a repudiation of their calling to be a people set apart, to be different, that they might reveal the blessing and wisdom of God. Remember that going back as far as Abraham, God had determined that his plan would be to call out a people for himself as a kind of object lesson to the world of what it looks like to have a right relationship with God and what that does to your relationships with one another. You treat one another justly. You care for the vulnerable and the elderly and the weak. You don't exploit one another. So that was God's intention, that they would be a different kind of people. But they just want to be like everyone else. And so they say no, in one sense anyway, to God's plan for them. And during Samuel's farewell speech, they get convicted and they repent. And part of a connection to the upper story that we see here is Samuel reminding them that God is the God of second chances, that it was a sinful thing to ask for a king, was not part of God's plan, but that even with a king, they can still choose the path of faithfulness and still fulfill their God-given destiny. And I believe that that sort of larger lesson is true for us as well. That we will, on occasion, choose against God's bigger picture plans, but it does not disqualify us. God is still the God of second chances, who, in his grace, finds a way that we can still choose the path of faithfulness and fulfill our God-given destiny in the upper story. Now, the other half of this chapter is about the king that the people end up with, this first king who is chosen by God, and his name is Saul. He is exactly the kind of guy they want. He's tall, like a head taller than everyone else. He's good looking, so he looks like a king. He is a great warrior. Apparently, he looks the part. But what we find out is in the chapter is that he is not a man after God's heart. And we see this a couple of ways. One way that we see it is that he can't admit when he's wrong. He justifies what he's done instead of confessing when he gets confronted with sin. He becomes defensive. And the other way that we see it is that Saul does not carry out the will of God. He does part of it, but he doesn't do all of it. He has this tendency to act like any other king. So, for instance, when they are sent to exterminate the Amalekites, which is kind of a disturbing passage, but it goes back to a judgment that God had made much, much earlier. Instead of exterminating them, Saul keeps the Amalekite king alive. We don't know why he does that. Maybe the king is kind of a victory trophy for him. Maybe it's just a favor done to a fellow king. We don't know. But he was supposed to execute him according to God's command, to fulfill God's judgment on the Amalekites. The other thing that Saul does is he keeps the best of the livestock and of all of the possessions of the Amalekites. And when confronted with it, instead of admitting that he had sinned, he says, well, we were going to sacrifice these things. And it wasn't me anyway, it was my men. But we were going to sacrifice these things. And Samuel says in a famous quote that is not in the story, to obey is better than sacrifice. And I think part of what we learn in the upper story here is that God is going to fulfill his purposes for the upper story. That's going to happen. But it doesn't have to happen through us. And our choices really can sideline us. God tells Saul, if you would just obey, your kingship could have endured forever. But now it ends with you, and God finds someone else who will carry forward his intentions in the upper story. So God's going to fulfill his purposes, but we can end up on the sidelines. And I think the lesson there is don't let that happen to you. God's standard is not perfection, but he does insist on faithfulness. And when we aren't faithful, we need to get that squared away real quick. We need to acknowledge that and repent. Well, those are some of the themes from the upper story from chapters 9 and 10. I hope you're enjoying your time in the story and that it's fitting together for you in ways that make sense. If it's not, come and find me. Let's talk. Love to help you figure that out. But God bless you for the ways that you are investing in one another and participating in the story, not just the book, the story, but hopefully connecting your lower story to God's upper story.